there's a pattern developing, and it's been there. It's just, under the surface because obviously Nebraska's had other things on their plate instead of playing Indiana as they are this week. But I have noticed it from a lot of different circles that folks downplaying Indiana's 6-0 start because they haven't beaten anybody. Who have you beaten? And so they're not necessarily looking at Indiana's metrics right now and saying, oh, well, big whoop. And it's true. I mean, according to K Ford's power rankings, the best rated team that Indiana has beaten, it was 59, Maryland. Maryland 59 in the current power rankings. The other wins are 71, Northwestern 72, UCLA 110, Charlotte 115, FIU, and Western Illinois is a FCS school. They're not rated by K Ford. So it's like, not that impressive. They haven't seen anybody like us. And yes, it's true. Nebraska's played a tougher schedule. Taking a look at Nebraska's numbers. 36 Colorado, 54 Illinois, loss. 63 Rutgers, 98 Purdue, 131 UTEP, unranked because they're FCS Northern Iowa. I mean, if you look at it, Nebraska marginally better, but not definitively better in terms of strength of schedule. But I sensed that something like this was coming because, I mean, let's face it, there is an element of, dare I say, jealousy. First year, Curt Cignetti comes in. Indiana's getting all the love. Indiana's getting all the attention. They're a surprising 6-0. This is their first year running the show. And there's a little bit of, well, why couldn't that be us? If Indiana can do it, why can't we do it? And that's a different conversation. But I think that's part of where this comes from. And the other part is, let's face it, a lot of people still window shop. They look at the name on the front of the jersey and say, oh, it's Indiana. They're not really that good. As we get into some of the numbers this week, let's start with the K Ford update. Mm-hmm. And even though Nebraska did not play, their rankings and the rankings of their opponents had an impact on this past week. So last week at this time, Nebraska was projected for 7.3 wins and had a 32% chance of at least getting to 8 wins. 69% chance of getting to at least 7 wins. But thanks to some movement around them, Nebraska actually dropped a spot in K Ford, and some of their opponents got stronger. For example, Wisconsin. Wisconsin blowing out Rutgers at Rutgers, a team that Nebraska went to the wire with 2 weeks ago. The Wisconsin game, which last week was a 58% chance of a Nebraska win, is now a 44% chance of a Nebraska win. It has flipped. It's sub 50% now because Wisconsin shot up the power rankings. They're 27th. The Iowa Hawkeyes dominated a Washington team that the week before defeated Michigan. The Iowa game has gone from a 36% chance of a Nebraska win down to a 30% chance of a Nebraska win. And Indiana, even though neither team played last week, the adjustment in the power rankings, the Indiana game has gone from a 30% chance of Nebraska winning to a 28% chance of Nebraska winning. By the way, the point spread, when it came out yesterday, was at 4.5. I believe at some places it may have opened at 3.5. I'm going to get an update here. The bettors have come in strong For Indiana, the spread has gone from 4.5 to 6.5 in favor of the Hoosiers.
Do these adjustments make you a little more concerned about Wisconsin?
I mean, watching Wisconsin the last 2 weeks has made me more concerned about Wisconsin, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Do I feel as confident in saying that Nebraska will win this game by double digits? Yes, I'm not very confident about that. But we'll see. We'll see. Nebraska now is sitting at 37% chance of winning 7 games, 24% chance of winning 8 games versus last week where it was 36 and 29% respectively. So the results of this past weekend did not help Nebraska's perception in terms of power rankings. We'll talk more about that with Kelly Ford when he joins us on the program on Wednesday. But looking at some of the numbers now for this matchup between Nebraska and Indiana. The website Game on Paper provides us with some interesting charts. I'm going to blow this up a little bit so it's easier to see.
Blow it up.
But this is, I don't know what they call this, a hemispherical graphic or what. It's basically, think of it as a big wheel, right? And the spokes, each of the spokes on the wheel represent a statistical category. And these are all analytics in terms of statistical categories. So the goal here in all of this...
It's a wheel graph.
They just call it a wheel graph? Okay, well,
yeah.
That makes it easy. But the bigger your circle is, the better you are. Because if, it's by percentile. So if you're in the 100th percentile, or I guess you can't technically be in the 100th, you can be in the 99th percentile. That means you're at the very top of the sport. And so again, the goal here is to have the biggest, best, most perfect circle possible. And so what I did here, for the purposes of those watching in on zonetv.live, is I put Nebraska's offense versus Indiana's defense and vice versa. And as you can...
Radar chart. It's called a radar chart.
Radar chart.
Thank you, Jordan.
That's even better.
That's a cooler name.
Actually, it kind of looks like a spider web. But anyway, if you look, a lot of Indiana's defensive strengths match a lot of Nebraska's offensive strengths in terms of havoc. We talk about havoc all the time. Plays that are disruptive to an offense, a pass deflection, an interception, a breakup, a sack, or a tackle for loss. Nebraska is above the 75th percentile on offense in preventing havoc, and Indiana's defense is above 75% percentile in creating havoc. Same thing with success on early downs, success on even in rushing per play. We think of Nebraska's running game as not being great, but in terms of their rush EPA, it's still just a little bit below 75th percentile. So it's not bad. It really isn't. The one area, and we say the weaknesses match up with the weaknesses. The reason why Nebraska's wheel looks like a disfigured Pac-Man, and the same with Indiana, is that on both sides, both offense for Nebraska, defense for Indiana, the rush explosiveness isn't good. Nebraska is not a great explosive team in terms of running the ball, but Indiana is not a good team in defending explosive run plays. So in a lot of areas in this matchup, Nebraska's offensive strengths match up with Indiana's defensive strengths, and the weaknesses match up with the weaknesses. There's really not one area. I suppose if there was one area where Indiana appears to have a pretty decent edge, it's in yards per drop back. So anytime your quarterback drops back, divided by the number of yards, or the number of yards is divided by the number of total dropbacks. Nebraska is about 65th percentile in that category. Indiana defensively is up very close to the very outer edge, almost 99 percentile. So that might be an area where Indiana's got a bit of an advantage. But again, the weaknesses match up with the weaknesses, the strengths match up with the strengths, which I found rather interesting. Then we do the opposite for Nebraska's defense versus Indiana's offense. And again, there's some spots on here where strength versus strength, weakness versus weakness. Indiana, in a lot of their passing offense, and we'll see that here in just a minute when we talk about some of the individual players. Passing success rate, yards per dropback, passing EPA, which is expected points added, non-explosive EPA passing. Indiana is basically at the top of the charts. Nebraska defensively, not quite as good, but still, that's some of the areas where it is strongest. But in some of the weakness areas, like average distance on third down, rushing EPA per play. Surprisingly, Nebraska, as good as their rush defense has been, is only around the 50th percentile in terms of rush EPA per play. And this is all weighted based on who you have played. Well, the same can be said for Indiana's offense. Their rush EPA per play is not that much better. So, in some ways, strength versus strength, weakness versus weakness. If there was an area where Nebraska's got a decided advantage, I really don't see one. And in areas where Indiana might have a decided advantage, there might be a little bit of an advantage in havoc. We've talked about Nebraska's havoc being pretty good this year. But again, when weighted for the opponent, it's only in the 50th percentile, whereas Indiana is closer to 75th percentile in preventing havoc. So that's a look at the radar chart for this game.
I'd be interested to find a radar chart around this time of year from last year with Indiana, just to see how much of an improvement.
I could look at one. I don't have it on me right now that I can display, but yeah, we can look back at last year's. I'm sure it's
the sheer turnaround that Indiana has made.
I'm sure it's dramatically different. Dramatically different. All right, so as we look at the individuals on offense in this matchup, it starts with Curtis Rourke, the transfer from Ohio, the former MAC Player of the Year 2 years ago. Remember, last year he had to sit out due to an injury. But this is the national leader in expected points added per dropback. He leads the country. We flashed this chart up earlier when Jack Mitchell was on in the first hour. But if you look at the gap between him in first place and Cam Ward, who some people have pretty high on their Heisman list, it's a pretty noticeable gap. Curtis Rourke is at 0.67 EPA per dropback. Cam Ward is next at 0.48. Don't worry about what do the numbers actually mean. Just look at the ratio at which one guy leads the next guy. Because if you look from Cam Ward on down, I mean, everybody else is pretty tight. But Rourke has a decisive advantage. Also in yards per dropback. Rourke is averaging 10.4 yards per dropback. Cam Ward is at 9.8, just for comparison's sake. Rourke is third in the country in completion percentage, completing 74% of his passes. He's third in yards per attempt, averaging 11 yards per attempt. And he leads the nation in NCAA quarterback rating. Plus, he's only thrown 2 interceptions versus 14 touchdowns.
So what you're saying is he's pretty good.
He's really good. And again, you can say they haven't played anybody. Fine. This will be a different challenge, no question about it. It will be the best defense that they have played. But all things considered, and remember, all these analytics are weighted based on who you have played. He is still at the top of the list in a lot of categories. Running the football. Now, we talk about Indiana, and we just assume, well, Rourke, great. Well, actually, before we go to rushing, let's skip down to the wide receivers for a moment. Their top 5 receivers all together make up. You could right now, if you just look at their EPA per target, so expected points added per target. If you were to go by the raw rankings on Games on Paper and compare it to an all-star team of receivers that Nebraska has played using that same metric, EPA per target, Indiana has a better group of receivers than an all-star team of receivers they have faced. Again, this is only based on this statistical category. So I'm not saying these receivers are better than Travis Hunter, that these receivers are better than Pat Bryant, for example, at Illinois. Just using the numbers, using the metric, this group of receivers ranks really, really high. Miles Cross is 28th in the nation, all receivers in EPA per target. Omar Cooper, 33rd. Elijah Surratt, I believe that's how you say it, Sarratt. He's 43rd. Keyshawn Williams, 66th. So right there alone, of all the receivers in the country, Indiana's got 4 of the top 66. By comparison, Nebraska has only played 3 receivers this year who rank inside the top 70. Kenny Odom at UTEP, Pat Bryant of Illinois, and believe it or not, LeJontay Wester of Colorado. All in EPA per target. And Miles Price, who is their second leading receiver in terms of catches, he's the lowest in EPA per target at 146th. By comparison, Isaiah Nayor is 47th in EPA per target. Jamal Banks is 141st. Now, this is just one analytics statistical category, but I use that to make the point that these receivers have, they haven't not only impressed on the field in terms of their traditional stats, but the analytics like them as well. As a group, this group has 1,900 yards receiving. They average 15 yards per catch, and they've scored 15 touchdowns. Now we can skip to rushing. Because while we have talked up the Indiana passing game, Indiana's got 23 rushing touchdowns this year.
Whoa.
Nebraska, by comparison, has 11 rushing touchdowns. Justice Ellison averages 6 yards a carry. He's got 6 touchdowns. And Tyson Lawton has 7 touchdowns this year, averaging nearly 5 yards per carry. So even though they have dazzled through the air, running the football, they've been really good. As a team, Indiana averages 5 yards per carry.
You're not painting a very optimistic picture, John.
Well, it's not about painting an optimistic or a pessimistic picture. It's about just painting a picture of here's how good they have been. Mm-hmm. And again, you can talk all day long about, well, they haven't played anybody, but you still got to go out and perform.
Yes.
And they have done that in every single game. So they're going to come in with a lot of confidence. And the one game I watched a lot of was the UCLA game. Indiana could not be stopped. The only thing that stopped them was their own mistakes. And most of those were on defense. This is a really good offensive team. This is the best offensive team Nebraska has faced. If I wanted to paint a pessimistic picture, I would paint it this way. The one team that made Nebraska struggle because of their balance was Illinois. And even then, Illinois really didn't capitalize on their balance until the fourth quarter when they started to run the ball better. Mm-hmm. Because before the fourth quarter, they weren't running it that well. But they were still giving Nebraska fits, even in the first 3 quarters when they weren't running the ball. Then the run game started to kick in, and that's when Illinois took over and eventually won the game. That has easily been the most balanced offense Nebraska has played. This is a better offense. This is a better offense than Illinois. And so from that standpoint, that's probably the thing that concerns me the most. I would not have as much concerns about this game if I just quoted Curtis Rourke and the receivers and the passing game. But the fact that they can add the running component to it, a good balanced offense is going to give any defense fits. So this isn't even a value judgment necessarily on the black shirts, but this will be the most balanced offense Nebraska has played to date, because even if Nebraska is able to stop the run, will they be able to prevent Curtis Rourke from dropping back and throwing? They're going to have to get more pressure than Rourke has faced this year to make him uncomfortable. The 2 biggest keys I see early in this game is not allowing explosive run plays and getting pressure on the quarterback.
That's what I like so much about this radar chart that you had here, because it does a good job visualizing exactly how well balanced of a team this is.
They are.
Like, where they're lacking, but they are solid in so many different aspects.
Yeah. As Carson points out, and this is a good point, 23 rushing touchdowns for Indiana versus a team that has not allowed a rushing touchdown this year. That's why I think, going back to those radar charts, the strengths match up with the strengths and the weaknesses match up with the weaknesses. And I think that's going to make for a really interesting game on both sides of the ball, which then frankly scares you a bit when you think about special teams. Because if this game's going to be close, special teams is probably going to have a lot to say about what happens, and we all know where Nebraska has struggled this year. And they can't let that get in their way. I completely get why Indiana is favored, why they're favored by this much, why the bettors have come in early on Indiana. I get that. The one thing that you hope for is that maybe with the off week, Indiana's reading a little bit more of its press clippings, that they're going to be a little too amped up because they're going to be on the national stage in the noon window this weekend. They've got big noon kickoff coming. They've got the potential to have a huge audience. They've never had a chance to host anything like this before, and maybe that'll get into their heads. And Nebraska at least has been there, done that. They had that high-pressure game against Colorado, so they're a little more, I guess, prepared for it. And as we know, a lot of this game is also played between the years. And good afternoon, Grant.
Hello, how are you?
Good.
I think there's a misconception about Indiana. They played Indiana State, who was a miserable team. They scored 77.
Mm-hmm.
So those numbers are so inflated. Their offensive line is not very big, not mobile. Their back end on the defensive backs are very slow. They have played nobody. Those numbers are not even close to reasonable. So I don't know why we're worried about that.
So you're not impressed at all that they have gone out there and even against these so-called mismatched foes, they've gone out and dominated every one of them.
Yeah, not a word. I mean, they played Indiana State, UCLA.
Nebraska played Northern Iowa.
Right, and then they're about it. UCLA's probably about as good as Northern Iowa. To be quite honest. North Dakota State's probably better. South Dakota State's better.
Well, we're not, but neither of those teams played those schools, so it's really immaterial. Right. My point is this, Grant, is that yes, has Indiana played a weak schedule? Yes, but I wouldn't say Nebraska's played. They haven't played a dominating schedule either.
But they have not played defensive line as dominant as ours, and
and Nebraska hasn't played an offense as good as Indiana's. Right?
Because do we know Indiana's offense is good?
I mean, if you watch them, Grant, yes, you can say, say what you want about UCLA, but those are still those are still top rate. Those are still highly recruited players.
That skews the number. Everybody scored 40 against UCLA this year.
Minnesota didn't.
Well, they still beat them.
Yes, they did. Yes, they did.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, we need to slow down on the Indiana hype until they win something.
All right, so you got a score. You got a score. What do you think? How much does Nebraska win by?
13.
All right, Nebraska by 13. Put it down.
Yep.
You don't have to give me a score, but 13's fine. We'll put it down. Grant, thanks for the call. Grant says Nebraska by 13. See, there is a lot of window shopping going on with this matchup. There's a lot of people that dismiss Indiana because they're Indiana and they haven't played anybody. But when you look at the power rankings, Nebraska's schedule has been better, but not that much better than Indiana's. So any question you can bring up about, well, just how good is Indiana's offense? You could make the same thing. You could say the same thing about Nebraska's defense. The one team that made them honest, both running and passing, beat them. That's the biggest thing. Forget about, even throw out Indiana. Let's say they're playing Team Y this week, and we don't know anything about them. The one thing that concerns me about Nebraska's defense is the one time they got stressed, both running and passing, they didn't pass the test. Every other team on their schedule, they had a glaring weakness. They either couldn't run or couldn't pass, or in the case of Purdue, they couldn't do both. That's why I am not dismissing this game out of hand. But a lot of people are looking at this and saying, oh, it's Indiana. There's a fatigue. There's a factor of, oh, I'm tired of hearing about how good they are. I'm tired of hearing about how good they are. Don't let yourself fall into that trap. I'm not saying Nebraska can't win this game. They can. If they play clean football and don't screw it up on special teams, they can win this game. But it ain't going to be easy. And I'm not surprised that Indiana's favored. And at this moment, if I had to pick the game today, I would pick Indiana to win.